In 1946, after decades of being denied their right to vote, black citizens in Georgia saw a glimmer of hope. The Supreme Court had finally struck down white primaries, which were primary elections held in southern states in which only white voters were permitted to participate. But this victory was met with a violent backlash, a resurgence of white supremacist terror that would leave an indelible mark on the state. Leading the charge was Eugene Talmadge. During his 1946 gubernatorial campaign, Talmadge openly advocated for violence to suppress black voters. When asked how he intended to prevent black citizens from exercising their right to vote, his answer was a single word: pistols. This was more than a threat. It was a call to arms for his white supremacist followers, a promise that blood would be spilled to maintain the racial hierarchy. So in the aftermath of Talmadge's electoral victory, a wave of terror swept across Georgia. Signs bearing a chilling threat were posted at black churches. The first Negro who votes in Georgia will be a dead Negro. And this wasn't an empty threat, because in Taylor County, a black World War II veteran who had bravely served his country was murdered by white men for simply exercising his right to vote. Afterwards, a sign appeared stating that the first Negro to vote would never vote again. These weren't isolated incidents. They were part of a larger, more sinister pattern of violence and intimidation designed to send a clear message: black political participation would not be tolerated. So join us while we discuss the chilling history of black voting rights. And if you like stories like this, you can find more stories like this at OneMicHistory.com. Also, please support my audio-only channel, One Mic 2. But without further ado, let's get started. In the wake of the Civil War, the United States faced a monumental task of reconstructing its nation, fractured by years of conflict and the institution of slavery. The defeat of the Confederacy in 1865 liberated approximately 4 million enslaved black individuals, marking a pivotal moment in the nation's history. This newfound freedom was codified by the ratification of the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery. But for black Americans, the true freedom was encompassed by more than just being liberated from bondage. It was securing the full spectrum of citizens' rights, particularly the right to vote. But after the assassination of Abraham Lincoln and under the presidency of Andrew Johnson, the initial efforts towards Reconstruction showed leniency towards the former Confederate states, granting them significant autonomy in rebuilding their local governments. Southern state legislatures enacted black codes, which infringed on the civil rights of newly freed African Americans. Systemic barriers such as literacy tests and poll tax were later implemented by Southern legislators, undermining Reconstruction and disenfranchising black voters, denying their suffrage and other basic rights. These restrictive laws sought to maintain elements of the antebellum order in the post-Civil War South. In response to this, black Americans organized political conventions and protested their treatment, advocating for equal rights and suffrage. Outrage over black codes fueled radical Republicans in Congress, leading to the passage of the Civil Rights Bill of 1866. This legislation aimed to define black Americans as citizens with basic rights. This era was marked with significant advancements, including the ratification of the 14th and 15th Amendment, granting citizenship and the right to vote for black males. During Reconstruction, the South experienced a interracial democracy for the first time. Black men participated in elections, holding various public offices. Over 1,500 African-American men served in positions ranging from local sheriffs to state legislatures and as United States Congress members. Despite these gains, with the withdrawal of federal troops from the South following the Compromise of 1877, it symbolized the end of Reconstruction. Free from federal oversight, white Southerners swiftly dismantled Reconstruction reforms, setting the stage for widespread disenfranchisement of black voters for years to come. This wasn't done overtly. It was through a series of insidious tactics such as poll taxes, property requirements, literacy tests, all cleverly designed to sidestep protections promised in the 15th Amendment. Adding to these legal barriers were grandfather clauses and white primary practices, sliding open voting booths for impoverished whites while slamming the door closed for black men. The results were devastating. In just Louisiana, as an example, there were 130,000 black voters registered to vote in 1896, and by 1904, there were only 1,300. The systemic exclusion was reinforced with violence and intimidation. Spearheaded by groups like the Ku Klux Klan, their campaign of terror effectively neutered the Black political engagement, reasserting white dominance not just in the South, but sending tremors of racial tension across the nation, even worrying African Americans in northern states. Consider the events of the 1868 election in Alabama, where a newly energizing Black electorate came out to back Ulysses S. Grant for president. The specter of Black people voting so alarmed the local Klansmen that by 1870 midterms, they had unleashed a deadly assault on a gathering of almost 3,000 Black citizens, killing at least 4 and scaring countless others from voting. Also during this time was a rise in lynching, which was a racial terror tool that also stifled Black political involvement. Those who dared to organize, register, or run for office often found themselves the target of lynchings. From 1889 to 1922, the NAACP recorded 3,500 lynchings, which is almost 2 lives a week during this period. Beyond stripping away voting rights, the efforts were a direct assault on the citizenship of Black Americans in the 20th century. The consequences were stark: a dramatic decline in African American political representation, with no Black U.S. representatives in Congress from 1901 to 1929, and no Black senators until 1967. This led to organizations like the NAACP, which was established in 1909, spearheading efforts by challenging discriminatory laws through legal battles and advocacy. Martin Luther King Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which would inaugurate the Crusade for Citizenship in 1958, a bold regional initiative striving to double the number of Black voters in the South. This effort was aimed to spotlight the persistent injustices of Southern voting suppression in response to the largely ineffective Civil Rights Act of 1957. Between 1961 and 1963, the Albany movement in Georgia weaved voter registration drives into the fabric of its protests against segregation. This movement utilized street demonstrations and boycotts to relentlessly advocate for Black voting rights. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee took the fight directly to the South, focusing intensely on voter registration in Mississippi, with the understanding being that voting rights were essential to dismantling Jim Crow. The SNCC will face severe violence and resistance from white supremacists. A poignant example of this is in 1963 shooting of SNCC members Bob Moses, Randolph T. Blackwell, and Jimmy Travis, with Travis being severely injured during registration efforts in Greenwood, Mississippi. In response to this violence, civil rights activists launched the 1964 Mississippi Freedom Summer Project, but it was marred by violence when activists James Chaney, Michael Schwerner, and Andrew Goodman were murdered and found in a ditch, underscoring the deadly seriousness of the struggle for Black voting rights. This violence would continue with the Selma marches in 1965, which captured the nation's attention due to the brutal response from law enforcement, which was broadcast on national TV. All of these efforts culminating in the Voting Rights Act of 1965. This landmark legislation eliminated barriers such as literacy tests and poll taxes and introducing federal oversight in areas notorious for voter suppression. These measures had increased voter registration from just 23% to over 63%. The aftermath of the Voting Rights Act was marked by significant milestones for Black political participation, evidenced by Black candidates winning mayoral election in major cities, the election of Douglas Wilder as the first Black governor in Virginia, the rise of the Black Power movement advocating for greater self-determination, and questioning the Democratic Party's long-standing Black political dominance, sparking a totally different era of activism and political engagement. Once again, despite these gains, measures to suppress Black votes have persisted, often taking subtler forms like felony disenfranchisement, the implementation of voter ID laws, which disproportionately affect Black and Latino communities. These tactics resurfaced dramatically during the 2000 election in Florida, highlighting the vulnerability of Black voting rights, resulting in lawsuits and investigations that underscored the ongoing need for vigilance. In more recent times, the 2000s have witnessed unprecedented voter turnout among the Black community, culminating in the historic election of Barack Obama as the nation's first African-American president in '08 and 2012, when Black turnout exceeded that of white turnout for the first time in American history. However, the Supreme Court's 2013 decision in Shelby County versus Holder, which struck down key provisions of the Voting Rights Act, spurned a new wave of voter restrictions across various states, very reminiscent of earlier disenfranchisement tactics. In the aftermath of this, understanding the history is vital as the fight for Black voting rights continues, and resistance and activism in Black communities serve as a reminder of the importance of safeguarding the right to vote as we attempt to step forward as a more equitable and justice nation. But before I go, I'm going to leave you with this quote from John Lewis. "The vote is the most powerful nonviolent change agent that you can have in a democratic society. You must use it because it's not guaranteed you can lose it." Thank you. I'm your country boy. This has been One Mic Black History, and this is the story of Black voting rights. If you like stories like this, you can find more stories like this at onemichistory.com. Also support my second channel, One Mic 2, for audio-only episodes. If you'd like to support the channel monetarily, you can do so on my Buy Me Coffee on Patreon page in the description below. I'd like to thank all my financial contributors. Without you, none of this could be possible. And peace.